Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Hi and welcome. Today Great.com's talks with Deepa Namibar, who is the Director of Global Programs and Policy for asylumaccess.org. And if you haven't heard of them before, they are an organization which mission it is to make human rights a reality for all refugees. And if you haven't done so before, you definitely want to press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we're going to talk about human rights for asylum seekers and much more. So Deepa, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Great today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm really excited to be here.
Me too. So how would you describe Asylum Access to someone that is not familiar with your organization or even the problems that refugees are facing?
So I'll start with the problem that we're trying to solve. So there are around 26 million refugees who have, outside their country, who have fled their country because of war or persecution or threats to their safety. And they are predominantly in the global south. So they are neighboring countries from where they flee. And out of this 26 million number, there's about half of them are children. So it's huge numbers of children who are refugees. And out of this 26 million, roughly around 1% of refugees actually have a solution, which is to either be resettled to a third country, whether it's the US or Canada, Australia, some countries in Europe, or they can go home. But the 99% of that number is still stuck in limbo, really, in countries like Bangladesh, where there's over 1 million refugees, in the Middle East, where there are millions of Syrian refugees, in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and of course in Africa and in Latin America. And they're in countries that are often developing. They don't have basic laws or policies that actually give them any rights or give them very limited rights. And so the response of the response to the refugee system right now is primarily based on a system that was developed back in the end of World War II, which is humanitarian support, food, shelter, water, basic sanitation. It's meant to address a temporary problem. But the problem is that it's no longer temporary, right? So we have refugees who spend, on average, 20 years in exile. It means 20 years without a solution. And so this temporary humanitarian support, which is really critical for kind of emergency situations, it's just no longer enough, right? So if we think of 20 years where we don't have documents, or we can't go to school, or we send our kids to school, or we can't work legally, or we can't access healthcare, it's just a broken system. And so that is what Asylum Access was founded to change. We want to move the current response of refugees from a predominantly humanitarian response to one that is based on rights, that allows refugees to exercise their basic abilities to work and go to school and move freely. And so we like to think of ourselves as human rights advocates who really believe and use the power of the law to ensure that refugees have freedom, autonomy, and really the dignity to rebuild their lives, and also to strengthen the communities that they work in.
Yeah, those are some. I feel the heaviness of those numbers and the problem those families and people must be going through. And it got to be so hard as well when no one is really taking responsibility. It sounds like everybody's just hoping that the problem will go away, and obviously it doesn't. So what are the challenges? I understand there are many, but what are the challenges that Asylum Access are facing then? Is it to change laws, or is it to change cultures so people are more willing to let asylum seekers into their societies? Is it to help the people maybe in these temporary camps and settlements have a higher quality of life? What is the approach?
Yeah, so the challenges are so many. I think that the fundamental challenge is that shift in mindset that I was referring to earlier. This idea that we need more people who are within the system, and even in countries, to think about refugees not as recipients of aid, we just giving them cash handouts or temporary support, but think about them as people in our community who have skills and real desires to contribute to the economy, to their families, and to their communities. And so that shift in mindset, especially when there's so much xenophobia and misunderstanding about immigrants and refugees, that's a huge challenge. And so you're right, it's kind of the changing the hearts and minds approach is really important. But the really critical piece of what we're trying to do is twofold, and that's really kind of where we bring in our expertise, which is we need to change the laws. Most countries that, for example, the countries that we work in, Thailand, Malaysia, and Mexico, there are either no laws or very little laws that actually protect refugees. So if you're a refugee, you come to a country, come to Malaysia, there's no legal system that allows you to get a document that the government recognizes, so you can be detained. Even children can be detained. You can't get a work permit, so you have to work informally in the kind of the informal sector and not get any protections, and you can't go to school. And so we do a lot of advocacy with our partners towards the decision makers, just to show them really practical solutions, kind of win-win approaches to how they can be solid laws and policies that protect refugees and also help protect the interests of the government. So that's one piece of what we do, and the challenge also is to get governments to really buy into to see the value of that, and to see the importance in terms of their interests, to make sure that laws and policies work for them. And so I would say, yeah, the two big challenges that we face is kind of shifting the narrative about refugees, and also making sure that the laws and policies in countries that refugees find themselves are actually protect refugees and don't take away their rights.
Yeah, I see. It gotta be so challenging, right? Because when the refugees don't get any rights or opportunities, they are going to be. It's more likely that they will be people that are also causing problems for the society in one way or another, and then they get a stigma, and then people are less willing to take them in, and then it just becomes a downward spiral. So yeah, I understand that you need to make the politicians see how it's to their benefit to start helping the refugees. But how do you do that? Because they want to be re-elected as well, right? And it's might be easier to blame someone than it is to propose a long-term solution. So how do you change the mindset of the politicians?
Yeah, so when we think about advocacy, we think about it in so many different ways, and it's always like a different approach in a different country. And which is why in our national offices, it's always run by nationals, and also by refugees in the community, in those countries as well. They're very much part of the teams in most of the countries that we work in. And so in some contexts, it works better to kind of work through relationships, right? So build long-term relationships with decision makers, with members of parliament, to really build the trust, so that they trust us and our partners that we know what the needs of refugees are, that we're able to propose solutions that refugees themselves want, and that's going to be beneficial. So it's a lot of kind of bilateral trust building and engagement. That's one approach, and that's usually the most effective approach. But there's also lots of tools that we tend to pull out at different moments. So we use the media in some countries very strategically to highlight issues, to get members of the public on board with certain approaches or certain issues. For example, issues of child detention is a really big issue in all the countries that we work in. And recently in Thailand, we were able to successfully work together with partners to change those policies. And I'm happy to talk about it in a bit. And then we also use strategic litigation, so bring on cases in court. So use the judiciary to really challenge decisions of government that are just wrong or just violate the law. We also use international processes and international donor governments, or international organizations like the World Bank or UNHCR. So there's a lot of different approaches that we use, but it's really challenging, like you said, to get governments to shift their approach. But we've seen it be successful, and that's what we're really inspired by. We want to take the positives, what has worked, and tailor it, and keep building on it in the hopes that we'll be able to shift the mindset across a broader range of countries.
Yeah, I hear from the solutions that you're having that there's no easy answer to this question. And I understand that. So how do you address people then that's saying, okay, it's not our problem, it's not our fault, rather, that those refugees are here. So why should we fix it? So like, how can you change? Like, I understand why we should fix it, but why? How do we change people's mindsets?
Yeah, I mean that is an ongoing challenge, and I think that's where a big part of what we are increasingly focusing on is refugee leadership. I think oftentimes, we see movements like the women's rights movement or indigenous rights movement. It's always led by women. It's led by indigenous people, right? You can't fathom a movement that's not led by people who are affected by it. But for some reason, the refugee rights movement or the refugee response movement is not led by refugees. So they're kind of seen as, recipients of aid and kind of passive. And so, one thing that we've realized increasingly, it's not just a moral necessity to have refugees lead the movement, but to address your question, we think it's the most effective way to change people's hearts and minds when they hear directly from refugees, when refugees are in decision-making spaces, when refugees are, heard and seen in the media, when they are very much present, as opposed to just being, on the sidelines. And it's so easy to form perceptions and, misconceptions about them when you don't hear them or directly engage with them. So I think that's one important approach that the entire sector hasn't really invested enough time and resources in trying to do. So we hope that that's going to be one of the transformative ways that we can move this issue forward in a different way.
It's a really interesting perspective that I didn't think of right away, how important it is that the movement comes from within those communities. And I suppose what that would also create is a feeling of belonging, a feeling of community, a feeling of being part of some kind of solution. Because I guess that sense is being, to some extent, taken away from someone that is losing their country, their home, their family. So how important it is to recreate that. And
yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of solutions, I read on your website that you're saying that refugees are the solution. What solution do you see them being a part of, and how?
So the solution is that they need to, currently there are barriers that prevent them from being able to go to school, work, be outside, not be detained, not be interned in camps. And so we need to remove the barriers. So the solution is really just removing them. It's making sure that refugees, and so the part of it is shifting the laws, but the other part of it is also making sure that they are empowered, refugees are empowered to know what their rights are and to exercise them. So when we think of our two-pronged strategy of policy, advocacy, and legal empowerment, we've spoken a lot about the advocacy piece, right? So how do we engage with governments and how do we change hearts and minds? But the other critical component of what we do is ensuring that refugees know what their rights are, know what the laws are, and are empowered to use it. So for example, we have in Malaysia, there are very limited laws that protect refugees. But one thing they do have is laws that say if your employer doesn't pay you wages, or if you don't get a contract of employment, there's protections even if you're an undocumented worker, essentially. And so we work with refugees to empower them about what their rights are. So they can approach the authorities directly. They can discuss it with their communities to share with them, listen, if your employer doesn't pay you, you have rights. You can directly approach the authorities and get access to those rights. And so a big part of our two-pronged solution is that, the laws need to change, but also refugees need to know how to access them, right? It's not enough that there's a law that gives you, the ability to go to school. But if a refugee doesn't know they can go to school, then what is the point of the law, right? So we think of solutions in the sense of, we have the rights, but also refugees being able to exercise them confidently, and be able to share with their communities so that the message can spread and eventually more refugees can take advantage of any solutions or any protections that are present in the system.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. They know how to use the laws to their benefits. Otherwise, they're useless. So
Yeah.
how would you like to see laws changing in maybe the next 10, 20 years, both locally in Thailand, Malaysia, and so on, where you work, but also globally?
Mm. So we've already seen some positive progress, So for example, in Ethiopia, where we're beginning to explore a project there, the government has issued a proclamation a couple of years ago that essentially allows hundreds of thousands of refugees in camps to leave camps and to work. And in Uganda, the country has got one of the best policies in terms of ability for refugees to work and to move freely, has got amazing results in terms of, I think the Oxford University did a study about refugees in Uganda, which showed that 99% of refugees that were involved in the study were not dependent on aid; they were self-reliant. That refugees who were employers actually hired Ugandan nationals who created jobs. So there's a really great progress in Thailand, where we work. They, after many years of advocacy with Asylum Access and UNHCR and other organizations, the government a couple of years ago announced that they were no longer going to, or they were going to release children in immigration detention centers and place them into the community. In Mexico, similarly, the Congress passed a ban preventing children from being sent to immigration detention centers. So we're seeing progress in countries that ensure that refugees are able to be more self-reliant and work and protect them from being detained. And so that's what we like to see in the coming years. Stronger, more countries being able to say, hey, we realize that it's important that refugees are documented, that not having laws actually doesn't serve us. It doesn't serve our national security interests. It doesn't serve refugees. So let's have laws on the books, get them documented. Let's make sure they work so that they can contribute to us, pay taxes, be part of the community. Let's get them to school so children are, have education to feed their minds. They're not going to be radicalized and pose a further threat to our community. So these are the kinds of laws and policies that we'd like to see change. Access to healthcare now with COVID. COVID is not a citizen versus non-citizen issue. Everyone, it's one of the great examples of how we are so interconnected and that it's a public health issue. So everyone needs the same access to healthcare. And so these are the kinds of laws that we think are incredibly sensible, that are achievable, and that we need more people to be part of this movement to push for this kind of sensible laws that work for governments and they work really well for refugees as well, and the communities that they're in.
Yeah, that is a kind of progress I would love to see happening as well.
Yeah, us too.
Yeah. Yeah, let's keep our fingers crossed. And until then, what can someone as an individual that might be listening to this and feel inspired to make some kind of positive change, what can they do to help move things forward?
Yeah, so a couple of things. In so many countries, I'm sure your listeners are in, there are refugees there. And, for me, the most transformative experience that I had that made me leave my legal career to do this work was when I met a refugee. And just seeing the world through her eyes completely transformed my worldview. So I would really encourage people to reach out to refugee communities in your area. Many groups, they do so much of incredible work, but they don't have the kind of resourcing that they need. So if any of your listeners has, any spare change, donate. They always need contributions. But they also, need volunteers, teachers, architects to build community centers. If you have a business, think of how you can hire refugees. Think of how you can integrate refugees within your own community in the simplest ways. And then the second thing is, join the conversation. There's so many misconceptions, as you say. about refugees. People don't really know about who they are and what they can contribute. And so, engaging with good people. I've got great neighbors who really have, very worrying views about refugees, but, engage them, have a conversation, where they're coming from, see how I can share, pieces of knowledge that I have that can help shift those mindsets. So I think that's another really important way that we can slowly shift the way people think about it, think about refugees and their contributions. And then, of course, follow Asylum Access. We're on social media, Twitter. Our website is www.asylumaccess.org. We've got tons of updates there. You can subscribe to our newsletter. And yeah, I think those are some of the ways that your listeners can get a little bit more involved and engaged in the issue.
I really enjoyed that summary because the situation is so heavy. So I guess it's easier for some people to just look the other way. But what you're saying is open your eyes, be willing to look, start making some kind of positive change, share with your friends so the culture can slowly start to move towards integrating refugees instead of shutting them out.
Yeah, absolutely. It can so easily be seen as an issue that doesn't affect me. They're so far away. I mean, I never knew that there were hundreds of thousands of refugees in Malaysia alone, kind of working informally in the restaurant and in different, just around me until I opened my eyes and I saw it. And so I think it's the same for many of your listeners as well. And they're very much part of our community and we might as well embrace them.
Couldn't agree more. Deepa, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Great.com today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. And for you listening, if you enjoyed this interview, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that will show the algorithms that this is important. So more people get the chance to hear this information so they can make positive impact and make the situation easier for all of our refugees. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. What is Great.com? That is the most common question that we get. And the shortest answer I can give you is that we are a company that is moving money from the online casino industry and donates it to charities that is helping the environment. The long answer, unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you today. But if you're curious, definitely Google what is Great.com to learn more.